I never thought my life would turn into something I'd be ashamed to talk about, but here I am. From the outside, everything looked fine. Our home was calm, our routine steady, and people often said we were a good family. I believed that too, at least for a long time. I trusted that the man I married would stand beside me no matter what. I trusted that family meant protecting the weakest among us. In the early years, Daniel was quiet but dependable. He wasn't dramatic or loud with his emotions, but I thought that was just his nature. He liked peace. He avoided conflict. At first, that seemed like a good thing. I didn't realize that his need for peace came from fear of upsetting his parents, fear of standing on his own, fear of choosing anything that might make them unhappy. His parents were always present in our lives. They lived close, visited often, and had strong opinions about everything. What we ate. How we spent money. How we planned our future. I tried to be respectful because I believed marriage meant blending families. I told myself it was normal for parents to care. I didn't notice how often Daniel stayed silent when their words crossed lines. I didn't notice how quickly he agreed with them, even when it meant dismissing me. When Noah was born, my world changed in the best way possible. He became my center, my strength, my reason to keep going even on the hardest days. I expected Daniel to feel the same. In some ways, he did. He smiled at Noah, held him, and talked about plans for the future. But something felt off. His parents didn't show the warmth I expected. Their smiles were tight, their comments careful, almost distant. As time passed, small moments started to add up. Daniel would hesitate before making decisions about Noah. He'd say things like, "Let's think about what my parents would say, or if they might not agree with this." It confused me. I couldn't understand why grown adults needed permission to care for their own child. When I brought it up, Daniel brushed it off and asked me not to create problems. I began to feel alone in my own marriage. Every serious conversation ended the same way, with Daniel asking for patience, silence, or compromise. Always from me. Never from them. I started to realize that this wasn't about keeping peace. It was about control. About staying small so others stayed comfortable. The truth I hadn't faced yet was simple and terrifying. Daniel wasn't choosing between right and wrong. He was choosing between courage and fear. And fear had been guiding him long before I ever noticed. Looking back, the signs were there much earlier than I wanted to admit. In the beginning of our marriage, Daniel was gentle and polite, the kind of man who never raised his voice. He held doors open, remembered birthdays, and showed up on time. To everyone else, he looked like a caring husband. What I didn't understand then was how deeply his need for his parents' approval shaped every choice he made. Whenever we had to make even small decisions, Daniel would pause and say he wanted to run it by his parents first. At first, it seemed harmless. I thought he was just close to his family. But over time, it started to feel like our marriage had 4 people in it instead of 2. Their opinions always came before mine, and Daniel never questioned that order. After Noah was born, the interference became harder to ignore. His parents had strong opinions about how I fed, dressed, and cared for my child. They criticized my choices in soft voices that sounded polite but carried judgment. If I didn't agree, they would exchange looks or sigh quietly, as if I were being unreasonable. I expected Daniel to step in. Instead, he stayed quiet or gently suggested I let it go. There were moments when their behavior crossed from advice into disrespect. They would complain about how much time Noah needed, how loud he was, how our schedules revolved around him. Once, his mother joked that everything in the house now depended on a baby, as if that were a problem. Daniel laughed along, even though it hurt me deeply. That was the first time I felt something break inside me. Whenever I tried to talk to Daniel about it, he brushed it aside. He told me his parents meant well and that I was taking things too personally. He asked me to be patient, to avoid tension, to keep the peace for the sake of the family. I noticed how family never seemed to include me or Noah in those moments. It always meant his parents. Slowly, my voice started to disappear in my own home. Decisions about our child were discussed without me. Plans were made after conversations I wasn't part of. When I spoke up, Daniel looked uncomfortable, like I was putting him in an unfair position. I began to realize that I was expected to stay quiet so everyone else could stay comfortable. The betrayal didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It came in calm tones and gentle excuses. It came in moments where my feelings were dismissed and my role as Noah's mother was questioned. That was when I understood the painful truth: when it came to his parents, my opinions didn't matter. And once I saw that clearly, I knew something in our marriage was already deeply wrong. Everything changed the day the doctor sat us down and spoke in a careful, serious voice. Noah had a medical condition that wouldn't go away with time. It would require regular treatment, close monitoring, and a lot of money. I remember holding Noah's tiny hand and feeling fear rise in my chest, but I also felt something stronger: certainty. No matter what it took, I was going to do everything possible for my child. Daniel's reaction was different. He listened quietly, asked a few questions, and nodded, but there was a distance in his eyes that scared me. On the drive home, he barely spoke. I talked about treatment plans, appointments, and how we would adjust our lives. He just said we'd figure it out, but his voice lacked conviction. The pressure started almost immediately. Daniel told his parents about the diagnosis before we had even fully processed it ourselves. After that, everything shifted. His parents began calling more often, asking questions that felt less about concern and more about cost and reputation. They worried out loud about how this would affect the family, what people would think, and how long this situation might last. Daniel started repeating their words without realizing it. He asked if all the treatments were really necessary. He wondered if we should wait and see instead of acting right away. Each question felt like a small cut. To me, there was no debate. This was our child. But to Daniel, the problem suddenly seemed bigger than Noah. I noticed Daniel spending more evenings at his parents' house. He said they needed him, that they were stressed, that he didn't want to argue at home. When he was around, he avoided serious conversations. If I tried to talk about medical bills or upcoming appointments, he'd change the subject or say he was tired. I felt like I was carrying the weight alone. The worst moment came when Daniel repeated something his parents had said without softening it. He told me they believed Noah's condition would damage the family's image and drain resources meant for other things. Hearing those words out loud made my stomach turn. I waited for Daniel to disagree, to defend our child. He didn't. He just looked away. From that point on, the emotional distance between us grew wider. Daniel became cold, distracted, and short-tempered. He stopped asking about Noah's progress. He stopped coming to appointments. It was as if facing our reality required more strength than he had. I realized then that Daniel wasn't just struggling, he was retreating. Instead of standing beside his child, he was hiding behind his parents' fears and opinions. And in that silence, in that absence, I felt a heartbreak deeper than anything I had known before. I didn't go looking for the truth. It found me on an ordinary afternoon when I stopped by Daniel's parents' house to pick up some paperwork he had left behind. The house was quiet when I walked in through the side door, and I could hear voices coming from the living room. I recognized Daniel's voice and his father's. I was about to announce myself when I heard my son's name and I froze. They didn't know I was there. The conversation was calm, almost businesslike. That scared me more than anger would have. His father talked about protecting assets and keeping things within the family. His mother mentioned future plans and how important it was not to let emotions interfere with long-term stability. Then I heard something that made my hands shake. They were talking about legal steps to make sure certain responsibilities didn't fall on Daniel. I listened as they discussed finances, property, and future income, carefully separating Noah from everything. They spoke as if my child was a liability, not a person. What hurt most was Daniel's role in it. He wasn't arguing. He wasn't pushing back. He was asking questions, taking notes, agreeing with their concerns. He sounded unsure, but not opposed. His parents reminded him of what he stood to lose if he didn't follow their guidance. They talked about inheritance, the family business, and the reputation they had built over decades. They made it clear that supporting Noah fully would complicate everything. One of them even said Daniel had to think about his real future. Then came the moment that broke me. Daniel said he felt torn but didn't want to disappoint them. He said he needed time to think and that maybe creating some distance was the best option for now. Distance. From his own child. Hearing that word felt like the ground disappeared beneath me. I stepped away quietly before they could see me. I sat in my car and cried until my chest hurt. Everything I had been sensing suddenly made sense. The hesitation. The avoidance. The silence. It wasn't confusion, it was calculation. He was weighing his parents' approval against his responsibility as a father. That evening, when Daniel came home, I looked at him differently. I saw someone smaller than I remembered, someone afraid of losing comfort more than afraid of losing his child. I asked him directly if there was something he wanted to tell me. He said no and avoided my eyes. That was confirmation enough. From that moment on, trust no longer existed between us. I realized that the betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was planned, discussed, and justified behind closed doors. Daniel wasn't being pulled away from his child. He was slowly stepping back on purpose. I went to bed that night knowing one painful truth. If I didn't protect Noah, no one else in that family would. And that realization changed everything inside me. The breaking point came sooner than I expected, and it came in the quiet of our kitchen. Daniel stood across from me, arms crossed, eyes tired, like he had already made his decision. I asked him directly where he stood. I told him I needed to know if he was willing to fully support Noah's treatment, no excuses, no delays. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he sighed and said I needed to accept reality. He explained that the treatment plan was too much, that it would take years, and that it would drain resources meant for other responsibilities. He spoke calmly, as if he were explaining a budget problem instead of talking about his own child's health. I waited for him to say he was scared or confused. Instead, he said something that ended everything. He told me his parents came first because they had always been there for him. He said they had supported him his whole life and that he couldn't turn his back on them now. He said I was asking him to choose, and that choice wasn't fair. In that moment, I understood he had already chosen. He just wanted me to live with it quietly. I felt something inside me go numb. I wasn't just hearing a husband refuse support. I was hearing a father step away from his responsibility. I asked him if he understood what he was saying, if he realized what this meant for Noah. He looked away and said he hoped I'd be reasonable. That word, reasonable, felt like a knife. There was no yelling. No dramatic fight. Just a heavy silence that filled the room. I looked at Noah playing on the floor, unaware of the conversation shaping his future. I realized staying would mean constant fighting, begging, and explaining why my child deserved care. I knew I couldn't raise Noah in a house where his worth was questioned. That night, I packed what we needed. Clothes, documents, Noah's favorite toy. Daniel watched but didn't stop me. He asked where I was going, and I said I needed space. He didn't argue. That hurt more than if he had. It told me everything I needed to know. As I carried Noah out the door, my heart felt shattered, but my steps were steady. I wasn't running away. I was choosing my child the way Daniel never could. The grief was heavy, but beneath it was something new, clarity. I understood that love without action is empty, and promises without courage mean nothing. I didn't know how hard the road ahead would be. I only knew one thing for sure. Noah would never feel unwanted on my watch. And from that moment on, I stopped waiting for Daniel to become someone he clearly wasn't. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I was suddenly doing everything on my own. Every appointment, every late night, every bill came with my name on it. The weight of responsibility was heavy, and there were moments when fear crept in and made it hard to breathe. But each time I looked at Noah, I reminded myself why giving up was not an option. Money became a constant worry. Treatments, medication, and basic living costs added up quickly. I cut back on everything that wasn't necessary. I learned how to stretch what little I had and asked for help only when there was no other choice. It wasn't easy, and pride had to be set aside, but my focus stayed clear. Noah needed stability, and I was determined to provide it. At the same time, I started keeping careful records. I saved every medical report, every message, and every missed payment. I wrote down dates, times, and exact words spoken in conversations that mattered. It felt strange at first, like I was preparing for a battle I never wanted. But deep down, I knew I needed to protect my child in every way possible. Daniel's parents didn't stay silent for long. They reached out through short messages and tense phone calls. They warned me about the consequences of pushing too hard. They suggested I would lose support, security, and peace if I continued down this path. Their words were polite but carried a clear threat. They wanted me to back down and disappear quietly. Daniel himself stayed distant. He didn't argue on their behalf, but he didn't stop them either. He avoided taking sides, claiming he didn't want conflict. When I asked for help or clarity, his answers were vague. He said he was overwhelmed and needed time. Time was something my child couldn't afford. There were nights when exhaustion took over, and I questioned whether I could keep going. I cried in silence, careful not to let Noah see my weakness. But every challenge also showed me something new about myself. I learned how strong I could be when there was no one else to lean on. I learned that fear loses power when you face it head-on. The intimidation didn't work. Instead of scaring me, it pushed me to become more prepared. I understood that standing up for my child meant standing alone sometimes. Daniel chose comfort and approval, hoping things would resolve on their own. I chose action even when it was terrifying. By the end of those months, I wasn't the same woman who had walked out with a suitcase and a broken heart. I was tired, yes, but I was also focused. I had turned pain into purpose, and I was ready to take the next step to secure Noah's future, no matter who stood in my way. I didn't think of what I was doing as revenge at first. It felt more like survival. But as the process moved forward, I understood that quiet action can be more powerful than anger. I reached out for legal help, not to hurt anyone, but to make sure Noah's future was protected. Every step I took was careful and measured. Filing for sole custody was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made. I knew it would change everything permanently. But I also knew that leaving Noah's future uncertain was not an option. I submitted the records I had kept, showing medical needs, missed support, and lack of involvement. I didn't exaggerate or add emotion. I let facts speak. Child support followed naturally. It wasn't about punishment. It was about responsibility. I requested what was necessary to cover Noah's care and nothing more. For the first time, Daniel was required to answer questions he had avoided for months. He couldn't hide behind silence or comfort anymore. The process forced his parents into places they couldn't control. They were used to private conversations and influence behind closed doors. In legal settings, their opinions carried no weight without proof. Their confidence faded as details became public and timelines were examined. The image they worked so hard to protect began to weaken. Daniel struggled under the pressure. He looked lost and unsure, no longer shielded by his parents' planning. When asked direct questions, he hesitated. His lack of action spoke louder than any excuse. Watching him face consequences wasn't satisfying, but it was necessary. I stayed focused on one thing, Noah's well-being. I kept my emotions in check and followed advice carefully. Each document submitted felt like reclaiming control over a life that had been dismissed by others. I wasn't trying to destroy anyone. I was simply refusing to be erased. As the case moved forward, I felt a shift inside me. Fear gave way to confidence. I realized that standing up for my child also meant standing up for myself. The system didn't care about family names or past influence. It cared about responsibility, proof, and truth. By the time the legal process was fully underway, the balance of power had changed. The people who once dismissed my voice were now forced to listen. And in that quiet shift, I understood that real revenge isn't loud or dramatic. It's building a future where those who failed you no longer get to decide your worth. Walking into the courtroom felt unreal. I had never imagined my family's private pain would be spoken about in such a public place. Still, I held my head high. I reminded myself that I was there for one reason only. Everything else faded into the background. When Daniel was asked to speak, the room grew quiet. He looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat, choosing his words carefully. But careful words couldn't hide the truth. Question by question, it became clear that he had delayed decisions, avoided involvement, and placed other priorities above his child's needs. When asked directly why he failed to act, he admitted he didn't want to go against his parents. That admission changed the air in the room. For the first time, his choice was said out loud, without excuses. He had followed demands instead of responsibility. The judge listened closely, asking follow-up questions that left no space to hide. Silence filled the gaps where action should have been. His parents were also questioned. Their answers were polished at first, but cracks began to show. They spoke about family interests and long-term plans, avoiding direct concern for Noah's care. Their words revealed more than they intended. It became clear that their influence wasn't supportive, it was controlling. I stayed calm through it all. I didn't interrupt or react. I let the truth unfold on its own. The evidence spoke clearly, painting a picture of neglect and misplaced priorities. The court didn't need emotion to understand what had happened. When the decision was announced, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Full custody was granted, along with secure financial support for Noah's medical needs. It wasn't a victory celebration moment. It was a quiet confirmation that my child's safety and future mattered. Daniel's expression said everything. He hadn't just lost money or legal standing. He had lost respect. The authority his parents once held over him offered no protection here. Obedience didn't equal loyalty, and loyalty didn't replace responsibility. As I walked out of the courtroom, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because someone else had fallen, but because my child was finally protected. Justice didn't come with applause or drama. It came with clarity. And that clarity gave me peace. After the court ruling, life changed in ways I hadn't fully imagined. Daniel's parents, who had once been so involved and controlling, began to pull back. Their plans had failed, and suddenly the influence they thought they had over our lives disappeared. I didn't feel satisfaction in their absence, it was just a quiet fact. They no longer dictated our choices, no longer made Noah's life feel like a burden. Daniel, on the other hand, tried to reach out. At first, it was small messages, cautious and hesitant. Later, he appeared in person, his voice filled with regret and his eyes searching for a connection he had ignored for too long. He apologized for not supporting Noah, for letting his parents' wishes come before his child, and for all the years of silence. It was clear he was sorry, but his apology came too late to undo the pain. I listened, I nodded, and I said nothing about reconciliation. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because I understood something important: forgiveness does not automatically mean access. I had spent months building a life of stability for Noah and myself, and letting Daniel back in would risk that hard-won peace. I realized that protecting my child and myself was more important than granting someone else comfort. I watched him walk away, carrying his regret, and felt no bitterness. There was a strange kind of closure in knowing that the people who had caused so much pain were no longer able to interfere. Daniel's parents faded from our lives, and Daniel himself remained a distant figure, learning the consequences of choices he had made too late. I didn't have to fight anymore to keep Noah safe. The system, the law, and my own determination had done that for me. The emotional revenge, if it could be called that, wasn't about humiliation or anger. It was about building a life where those who failed us no longer had power. I had done what needed to be done. I had ensured Noah's safety, health, and well-being. I had taken control of the future that Daniel had almost abandoned. That quiet sense of victory was far more satisfying than any dramatic confrontation could have been. As days turned into weeks, I focused on rebuilding our home, our routines, and our happiness. Noah thrived in the stability I provided, and I discovered strength I didn't know I had. I learned that peace is earned through action, not wishes. And in that peace, I finally felt free. The people who had once threatened our family no longer mattered, and I no longer needed them to validate my life. We were safe, secure, and finally able to move forward. Watching Noah grow has been the most rewarding part of everything I've been through. Every smile, every word he learns, every small milestone reminds me why I fought so hard for him. He's thriving in an environment filled with love, care, and stability, things I promised him from the start. Seeing him happy and confident makes every struggle, every sleepless night, and every tear worth it. I often think back on the choices that led us here. Daniel chose comfort and approval over responsibility, and the consequences are clear. I have no doubt that his parents' influence shaped him, but ultimately, the decisions were his. Choosing others over your own child destroys trust, shatters families, and leaves wounds that never fully heal. I learned that lesson in the hardest way possible, but I also learned that resilience comes from facing betrayal and refusing to be broken by it. The experience has changed me. I'm stronger than I realized, more patient, and far more cautious about who I trust. I've learned to rely on myself, to act when action is needed, and to protect those I love without compromise. I understand now that love alone is not enough. Responsibility, courage, and integrity matter far more than comfort or obedience. Daniel didn't just lose access to Noah, he lost the chance to prove himself as a father, as a man capable of standing up for what truly matters. I don't feel anger toward him anymore, only a quiet recognition of the gap between potential and action. His absence has shaped my life, but it has also taught me to value presence, effort, and true commitment above all else. Life is quieter now. Our days are simple but full, filled with laughter, learning, and small victories. Noah feels safe, and that safety is a direct result of the choices I made when everything seemed impossible. I built a life on clarity, honesty, and love, without the fear or manipulation that once surrounded us. Looking back, I understand that pain can lead to growth if you let it. Betrayal doesn't have to destroy you. It can show you who you are and what you're capable of. I am no longer the woman who relied on others to define her worth. I am steady, confident, and unbreakable. My focus is on the future, on raising Noah to be strong and compassionate, and on living a life that is mine to shape. In the end, the story isn't about loss, it's about what I gained: clarity, strength, and freedom. Daniel may have lost his chance, but I found mine. And in finding it, I discovered something far more important than revenge or anger. I discovered that I am capable of facing the worst and still building a life filled with love, respect, and hope. That is the truth I will carry forward, unshaken and unafraid.